Isaiah Crow.
All units have left the station and are returning now. Status on the ground crew? They've just lifted off, sir. Approximately 6 minutes until Skyhook capture. Just 6 minutes, and this operation would be over without even a single notable incident to mar the record. The height of injuries suffered totaled to a few punctured implants and banged-up armor suits, courtesy of a few zealous Gretonian shotgunners. Both crews ended up extracting and relaying intel packages, and the station crew also managed to secure a few high-ranking individuals as prisoners. We came here with low expectations, looking to announce our prowess and prove to any possible allies that we were worth our weight in salt, but we came out with our arms full of gold for it. One might argue there was a humanitarian complication on the ground site, but that whole ordeal was instigated by an alien mercenary anyway. Minimal paperwork for me. So why couldn't I shake this sinking feeling? We were right at the finish line, far beyond any realistic points of failure. Hell, we didn't even need to spend the time reeling in the drop pod before leaving this place. We could jump away as soon as they were latched onto the magnetic skyhook, if need be. Despite this, there was still a pressure on my chest, making it hard for me to sit still. And I wasn't referring to the usual phantom itch afforded by this plastic crap replacing my skin. This mission had been completely unorthodox in execution, and I couldn't help but feel throughout the whole thing that some unaccounted variable would rear its ugly head at any moment. The introduction and swift integration of FTL technologies had the strategy experts non-stop babbling away at each other with all these outlandish ideas. And of course, I was the one picked for piloting their theoreticals. Warping in and firing at every point of interest before a response could be mounted, or a whisper could escape, while clearly effective when done successfully, was by no means a stress-free procedure. We'd placed this veil of muffling and pacification upon the entire planet, but not much external pressure was needed to blow this cover. All it took was for a single person to get suspicious at the lack of signal and start looking, or even an unscheduled civilian vessel to enter the premises, and things could get ugly quickly. We really didn't have a way to gauge how long we had until either of those might happen, and I hated working under invisible timers. "Warp trace detected, Captain. It's a Gretonian Corvette." God damn it. The theater kid in me took a moment to physically wince while a visual display of the Corvette in question materialized across my office, creating the illusion that I was looking out onto the scene through a massive glass wall. While I could see the ship in excruciating detail, the reality was that it was much further away than the human eye would be able to discern, and equally out of range for most of our offensive options. I stared at it floating listlessly in space as I racked my brain trying to figure out what their goals might be. They were too far away for an engagement, and even if they weren't, a singular Corvette wouldn't hold a candle to the Challenger Deep's combat ability. The only option left on the table that explained their idle behavior was that they were calling for reinforcements. "Get me on a line with that ship." "They've blocked off all communications, sir." "Send them a handshake." A missile was let loose from one of the many gantries lining the ship. There wasn't anything particularly fancy about it, aside from its gargantuan range and constant acceleration in flight, but it wasn't intended to pose a real threat. It was the modern version of a warning shot, and even the most basic of point defense or thermal tracking countermeasures could knock it off course. The point was to communicate that one's presence was not tolerated in the slightest. A few tense seconds passed as the missile closed in before the enemy ship offered a response. The ship's image seemed to warp and distort, surrounding itself in a bubble of twisted light as glitchy artifacts flickered over the display screen until any traces of its existence promptly vanished from our sensors. Using FTL to evade a handshake was a bit of an overreaction in my book, but that was the least of my worries at the moment. It was safe to assume that word of our attack had already spread across the entire Gretonian military network. "Contact the Mayflower and spool up the FTL drive. We jump as soon as the drop pod is latched." "What is taking so long?" "Sir, the Mayflower retreated to the Meldrin system. The Grats just launched an attack." Before a reaction could even start building up within me, I got flashed by a blinding white light from the visual display on my wall. A precious fraction of a moment passed before the optic nerve implants regulated my light intake and reinstated my gift of sight. My eyes saccaded to the flashing red orb of lights being projected in a holograph. It took a second before an understanding of what I was looking at dawned on me. The dot in the center of that holograph was us, and we were completely surrounded in every angle by the massive Gratonian warships that had just warped in. "Sir, the FTL drive is charged." There was our way out. Our destination was close enough that we wouldn't be intercepted mid-jump, and we'd be better suited to fight back upon meeting up with our main force. The warships wasted no time in lobbing their full arsenal of physical ordnance at us, but that didn't pose a threat if we simply weren't there anymore. Just one caveat stood in the way. The drop pod was still seconds away from connecting. The time between the pod making contact with the skyhook and the enemy's attacks reaching their mark was incalculably small. The data being streamed to me had gone through countless computer algorithms and rounding operations before arriving, and I couldn't make a completely conclusive decision thanks to it. But I steeled myself to make a decision regardless. I've spent my entire career being told that I have too much heart, and that it would get me burned someday, only to find myself outranking them a few years later. Rare as it was, I was a man of some faith, and at that moment, I had faith that we would make it. We would make it. We wait for the pod.
Pioneer Dominique Reynolds. We're not going to make it. All I could do was watch through the tiny window in the roof of the pod as the scene unfolded around me. It was close, so inconceivably close, but the Challenger Deep would get completely shredded if it tried playing chicken here. She was a sturdy beast for sure, but no mixture of metals could resist that oncoming flood of munitions. Any sane individual would cut losses and jump away, leaving us here to return to space dust. Maybe I could survive for a bit longer, but I wasn't banking on it. A morbid take, sure, but there just wasn't any other realistic option. We failed, regardless of if it was our fault or not. So why hadn't the ship jumped away yet? That idiot Isaiah, huh? Too much heart for his own good. He's probably up there praying for a miracle right now. There just wasn't anything that could be done. The thrusters on the pod were fully burnt out, and we had no means to affect our velocity to a degree that would tip the situation to our side. No conventional means, per se. Seriously? That's your plan? I didn't waste time I didn't have on second thoughts. My brain was better spent calculating the angle and force needed for this stupid stunt while my body sprung into position. I tore off my harness and pushed off the seat before landing feet first on the roof of the pod. My arms moved to form a cone above my head, ensuring minimized resistance while I cranked up the force dials on my leg joints as high as they could go without resulting in uselessly punching holes through the roof. I realized that I'd ended up facing Dokchara during this setup, and I couldn't stop myself from being amused at his gobsmacked face as he stared back at me. It would have been a crime of the highest regard to not return his expression with a smug grin and wink. The entire pod creaked and groaned as I kicked off the roof and pierced through the floor. Its once cylindrical shape had been stretched and deformed, looking more akin to two cones being attached to each other. I looked back at it as I hurtled through space, witnessing it make an accelerated contact with the skyhook before disappearing in a flash of light, and the subsequent monolithic array of detonations from the numerous explosive shells colliding with each other instead of their original target. It was at this point that I finally started thinking about what would happen next. I was currently careening towards the planet, though this time with nothing to keep me covered. I could easily shrug off re-entry heating and the crash landing, but what comes after that? I had very little faith in making it past the orbital bombardment of even a single battleship, let alone the entire fleet up here. Is there even a chance they would take me as a prisoner? These worries were interrupted by my headlong collision with and subsequent dive into the hull of a Gratonian warship.